Right. Very good.
Hello, Anne. Good to see you.
You're in.
Okay. For those of you who are watching this on the video, today we're going to continue the first chapter of Stanislaus Joyce's book, My Brother's Keeper, which of course is on his brother James Joyce. And with that said, I will begin the reading. The faculty of ardent belief in the absolute is like the poet's gift. It does not come by fasting or praying or consuming midnight oil, but it hallmarks the man who possesses it. It hallmarked my brother, even when he deliberately chose for his subject the commonplace person and the everyday incident, the things that are despised. All his work is permeated by a kind of detotes, which is the antithesis of romanticism. It might be considered the distinguishing characteristic of modern writing, which signifies more than it says. There are still, however, some writers of very great talent who ransack the whole world for their subjects and their settings and are immensely popular. To me, they seem to be a good deal lacking both in subtlety and sincerity. They have gained the whole world but lost their souls. Moreover, unlike his friend Suevo, who was disappointed in not being a popular success, my brother never cared a rap who read him. I think he wrote to make things clear to himself. Why publish then? It might be asked. Well, the expression of our ideas and impressions, even when intended for ourselves, becomes clearer when addressed to others. And it is also a way to assume responsibility for them. Next, please.
My brother's choice of subjects flatters my vanity in a curious way. When we were both very young and my brother was still in the thraldom of the big words, I wrote in my diary in bungling schoolboy fashion that there are scientists whose work is concerned with infinite stellar spaces and who are hailed as great, and others deemed no less great whose work is at the end of the microscope. I opined that on a far smaller scale an analogous difference existed between writers, and that my brother would belong to the latter class. He used to read my diary without permission and be rather jocular about it, but he said when he read this entry, he thought I might be right. In the beginning of their married life, my parents seemed to have been what divorce court judges call reasonably happy. The children began to arrive at almost regular intervals of a year, the first in Dublin, among whom were my brother, the second, and I, the fourth. Then John Joyce went to live at Bray in the hope, as he used to explain politely and frequently, that the train fare would keep his wife's family away. I have no recollection of the earliest years in Dublin, but I have vivid memories of Bray. The removal out of range of his wife's too affectionate family, including 3 adoring aunts, does not seem to have mended matters very much. He had not quite relinquished his sporting life. He rode stroke of a 4-oared boat at Bray Regatta when he was 40 and won. I don't remember the race, but I remember seeing him training for it. He used to go fishing for plaice and flounders.
Place.
Sorry?
Sorry, I was helping you out. Place. I know it looks weird
Yeah.
the way it's spelled, but that's it. It's how it's spelled. Place.
How does it sound? Place? Place?
Place. Yeah.
Place. Okay,
Just
thank you.
like place.
Okay. Now I've lost my place.
I'm sorry.
Fishing for place and flounder.
And bathing with the above-mentioned bands and some fishermen of Bray, as hairy-chested as himself and as fond of the contents of the stone jar in the stern sheets of the boat where his bored and silent second son used to sit. At that time, his income was sufficient, his work light, even too light, his children healthy, and one of them precociously clever. His wife, who shared his taste for music and sang in the choir in Little Bray, patient in all things, resourceful, and not at all deficient in a sense of humor. I have a program of public concert given by the Bray Boat Club in the assembly room of the town in 1888, at which Mr. J.S. Joyce, Mrs. Joyce, and Master James Joyce, then 6 years of age, all sang. Friends frequently came down from Dublin to see him. Next, please.
Yet at home he was a man of absolutely unreliable temper. How often do I remember him sitting at a table in the evening, not exactly drunk, he carried his liquor too well then, but sufficiently so to have no appetite and to be in a vile humour. He had a terrible habit when half seized over of grinding his strong teeth with a noise that I used to think was caused by the creaking of a stiff white collar. In later years, my mother told me that she was often terrified to be alone with him, though he was not normally a violent man. Fat Mrs. Conway always retired early to her room on the upper floor, and the nursery and the servants' room were at the top of the house. He would sit there grinding his teeth and looking at my mother and muttering phrases like, "Better finish it now." At one time, she thought of getting a separation from him, but her confessor was so furious when she suggested it that she never mentioned it again. The perverted, morbid Jack-in-the-Box had bullied her out of seeking a separation, which probably would not have been permanent and would undoubtedly have been good for both. Next.
He had a nagging memory for petty offences to his pride that, with perverse constancy, kept his resentment green for years and years. When I was so young that this particular recollection is one of the vaguest and most remote that I have. We drove out with a few guests, among them my mother's stepmother, to whom all her family, except my mother herself, were hostile, to Powers Court Waterfall to picnic there. I remember the excursion very well. We were not alone, there were other groups. As I saw everything in inverse proportion to my height, my recollection is of a waterfall immensely high, and of a picnic on a green sward immensely wide, stretching away somewhere below it to a row of stately trees. I've never been back to Powers Court, nor have I any curiosity to know how it may be in reality. When the lunch basket was opened, it was discovered that the tablecloth had been forgotten. The stepmother suggested as a joke that one of the ladies should sacrifice a petticoat. Voluminous white petticoats were worn in those days. My father appeared to take the joke gaily, but for some mysterious reason it rankled and became another point in his perpetual indictment of his wife's family, even some 12 or 14 years after the death of the offending party. On another occasion, he was crossing the 15 acres, an open space in the Phoenix Park, with his brother-in-law, when a company of cavalry at exercise in the morning came galloping towards him at full tilt. The brother-in-law, my Uncle John Murray, started to run towards a clump of trees, but it was too far away, and the cavalry were almost upon them. My father ran after him, seized him, and forced him to stand still, so it was easy for the company of cavalry to divide and leave the two men standing between the lines. My father used to boast that as they charged past, the officer in command gave the order, and the soldiers saluted him with the sabres. This happy combination of his brother-in-law's panic and his own presence of mind was far too favourable a trying to go unrecorded. It was recorded perennially. Next, please.
But my mother was not a weak character, except in regard to her husband, and not without resource or energy in the government of her household, when the occasion called for it. I have a clear recollection of her dealing capably with a dangerous fire in the nursery chimney. Telephones were a rarity in houses then, and the fire brigade was not easy to call. I remember her sitting in the hearth, quickly but calmly, ramming up the chimney brooms, swathed in wet cloths, which the servants kept handing her, and a tub of water on the floor beside her. I have better reason to remember another energetic intervention. One day in early summer, Jim was already at Glengows. The whole nursery was out walking. The group consisted of 4 or 5 children, a nurse named Cranley, a young woman whose family were decent fisher folk from Britain, and a girl of 15 or 16, a younger sister or cousin who came to help her. We caught the eye of a photographer on the Esplanade who asked to be allowed to take the group. The nurse girls were delighted. Photographers were rare birds in those days, and that evening they got permission to have the photograph taken. The following afternoon, the girls put on their Sunday finery, and we all went out to meet the photographer, who arranged us in an artistic group on the green beyond the esplanade. I, 5 or 6 at the time, was to sit on the grass in the front with my legs crossed. But when the photographer said, "Now don't stir," I began for devilment to turn my head jerkily from side to side, and neither the photographer's persuasions nor the nurse girl's entreaties could induce me to stop. The photographer had to give up the idea of taking the group, and we all went back home. The nurse girls were furious, and when they told how I had deliberately spoiled the opportunity, they were almost in tears. My mother listened to their report and then promptly adjourned the session to the nursery, where I got a spanking, which must have been exemplary, seeing that I still remember it. Next.
My father and mother had many friends in Bray and in town. And at about Christmas time and the New Year, they often went up to dances in Dublin and stayed overnight at a hotel, as the Conroys do in the Dead. My mother would give the servants many anxious recommendations about what they were to do during her brief absence, which seemed to me like a parting forever. As long as she had retained her good looks, he made trifles excuses for scenes of jealousy. One night at a dance, one of the guests asked the hostess to introduce him to that pretty young lady. "By all means," said his hostess, "but let me tell you that that pretty young lady is the mother of 4 children. When the lady retailed the joke to them at the dance, my father laughed at it, but not when they were at home again, not for many months. For his part, he danced, I beg your pardon, and Miss here, your turn.
Yeah. For his part, he danced, and he was a good dancer with all the best-looking girls in the room, and took no notice of his wife. My mother, instead, had not a particle of jealousy in her composition. The photographs of my father's former sweethearts still stood on the piano when I was a child. I remember the names of 2 of them, Hannah Sullivan, a dark, energetic-looking girl, and Annie Lee, like the song. In each case, he had broken off the match in a fit of jealousy, unreasonable jealousy, according to my mother. One day, the photographs disappeared from the top of the piano. The next time my father had occasion to go into the drawing room, he at once noticed that they were missing. "Where are the photographs?" he asked. "Burnt," was the answer. "Who burnt them?" he asked again. "I did," said my mother defiantly. My father put up the monocle he sported in those years and looked at her. "No, you didn't," he said. "It was that old bitch upstairs." Next.
That old bitch upstairs was an elegant description of Mrs. Conway. He was right. Mrs. Conway had persuaded my mother that it was downright improper to keep the photographs in the drawing room where the children who were growing up and beginning to observe could see them. Of course, my father knew very well what kind of submissive wife he had. His scenes of jealousy were just a form of satisfaction that his male truculence required. My mother was sorry afterwards that she had yielded to the insistence of the elder woman, because, she said, they were all nice-looking girls, and perhaps, too, it had given her a sense of triumph to adorn her wigwam with their scalps. That's pretty good. Pretty good. Stanislaus is getting more lively now. Chapter 2, The Bud. My brother went up to Clongowes Wood College when he was 6.5 years of age, and during his first year there was nicknamed Half-Past Six. When my parents brought him up to Dublin to buy the list of things the college required of him to be provided with, and a trunk inscribed with his initials J.A.J. to put them in. I, almost 3 years his junior, was attached to the group 2 or 3 times as a usual, though unnecessary, appendage. Going to college was a new experience for my brother, and though he must have had some presentiments, he welcomed new experiences even at that age. There may have been some weakness at the moment of saying goodbye in the hall of the college. I was not there. But my recollection is that when my father decided to send him to Clongowes, he was eager enough to go and enjoyed being the center of such important preparations, including visits to shops up in Dublin and lunch and tea in town. Unlike me in this too, he always liked new adventures, new scenes, new people. The illusion of stability never seduced him. Katrina.
I was taken down to Clane a few times on visiting day to see him. Clane is a little town in his much-loved Liffey near Clongowes, the meadow of the Smith. There was a drive of a few miles by old-fashioned jaunting cars to the college. Of course, he was happy to see us, but the impression that has remained on my mind is not that of a boy who was lonely or felt out of place. He seemed to be perfectly free of his surroundings, a boy amongst boys. There was no reason why he should not be so. He was always at the top of his class and always in good health. His letters home usually ran, "Dear Mother, I hope you are very well, and Pappy also. Please send me." During his second or third year at college, he was chosen for the honor of serving as an altar boy at Mass. Even in sport, he distinguished himself. When after 4 years or so he left Clongowes, we had at home a sideboard full of cups and silver electroplate teapot and coffee pot that he had won in the school hurdles and walking events. He disliked football but liked cricket, and though too young to be even on the junior 11, he promised to be a useful bat. He still took an interest in the games when he was at Belvedere and eagerly studied the feats of Ranji Fry, Trumper, and Spofforth. I remember having to bowl for him for perhaps an hour at a time in our back garden at Richmond Street. I did so out of pure goodness of heart, since for my part I loathed the silly, tedious, inconclusive game and would not walk across the road to see a match. Next, please.
In running, he had a turn both for speed and endurance. Pat Harding, a friend of my father's, who was Irish champion for the 110-yard hurls at the time, when the American Cranslane was champion of the world, offered to train my brother for the hurls when he was in his last year at Belvedere, but my brother had already other fish to fry. They remained friends, and after my brother's elopement to Trieste, my father wrote, "In the whole city of Dublin, you have only two friends, Pat Harding and Tom Devon." In the story Grace, Tom Devon appears as Mr. Power, but the down-at-heels trainer in Stephen Hero is not Pat Harding, who is a lively young solicitor. As for training, the most Pat Harding himself ever did was a week or two before a meeting. My brother was very fond of swimming too. He was a splashy swimmer, but fast. Over a short distance, he could beat his burly friend, Gogarty, who was, of course, a far stronger swimmer. And he was an indefatigable walker. On one occasion, he wished to go to Selbridge to interview an Irish-American millionaire who had bought an estate there and was reputed to have the intention of playing the part of Maecenas to young Irish geniuses. As my brother had not trained there, he walked from our house in Cabra to Selbridge to propose himself as a suitable subject, but was repulsed at the gates by the lodge keeper, who was unsympathetic and slow of wit. Selbridge, a distance of about 14 miles. My brother went to the post office and wrote a letter to the Irish-American millionaire, whose name was Kelly, and then on the same day walked back to Dublin. I hope in the day of judgment to find out definitely whether it was stupendous cheek on the part of my brother or bad business on the part of the Irish-American millionaire. At the time, I took the former view, my brother the latter. But now I am inclined to think that my brother may have been right. At any rate, the Irish-American, who was not responsible for the repulse, wrote my brother an apologetic letter, and getting no reply, wired to know whether his letter had been received. I have both the letter and the telegram. Anne?
Okay. My brother detested rugby, boxing, and wrestling. which he considered a training not in self-control as the English pretend, but in violence and brutality. When most of the newspapers of America and England, and even of Trieste, carried 5-column banner headings on their front pages about Jeffries, the White Hope, in that epoch-making event, the Johnson-Jeffries boxing match at Reno for the heavyweight crown, his ironical comments was a rough draft of the description of the Myler-Keogh-Bennett fight in the Cyclops episode. There, however, it is used not to express personal bias, but to associate violence and brutality with patriotism. Moreover, his first interest as a boy in the figure of Ulysses was aroused when his class was reading Lamb's Adventures of Ulysses. The boys were asked to say which of the heroes they admired most. My brother chose Ulysses in reaction against the general admiration for the heftier, muscle-bound dealers of Homeric blows. My father had, no doubt, begun with the intention of giving his promising young son the best education the country had to offer a boy of his class and religion. But after a very few years, that good intention, unfulfilled, formed just a minor item of the wreckage and the gradual ruin of his affairs. His office hours were short, from 10 in the morning to 3:30 or 4 in the afternoon, and his work was light and easy. But such as it was, he neglected it. To judge from his own reminiscences, he seemed to have spent his time in the office drinking and telling good stories with convivial companions of the same kidney, whom he found there. They even played practical jokes on respectable old gentlemen who came to protest about their rates and taxes. If his work took him out of the office, the brief fiction of business soon ended in the bar of some hotel. Next, please. Lois.
Urgent work, such as the sending out of final notices to taxpayers, was neglected. And at the last moment, he would have a couple of unemployed old clerks scribbling in his house from morning till midnight to help him to catch up on his arrears of work. When finally he succeeded in getting the notices out in time, he would lean back and take things easy again. Then, being an excellent mimic, he would tell his friends at home and in bars good stories about the poor devils he had got in to help him, about the boozy one whose wife used to beat him, who turned up one morning with a black eye and a scratched face, and told a stale lie about colliding with the door of a cupboard in the dark. Story in dialect, sympathetic question, circumstantial answer with running commentary. Or about the other, who, owing to the high cost of handkerchiefs, used to blow his nose in sheets of tissue paper. I dare swear that government work could be done in that way only in Ireland, or perhaps somewhere in the Balkans, or someplace at the back of Godspeed in Tsarist Russia, before the Inspector General paid a surprise visit. Nor was the brown leather bag in which he carried the taxes he collected always inviolable, though he did defend it against 2 thieves who set upon him one night. He succeeded in beating them off with his blackthorn stick, and so had another story to tell over and over again. And after years, his own borrowings from the bag, however, became more and more frequent, and made it necessary for him to have recourse to moneylenders for fairly large sums at short notice. His property in Cork was gradually covered with mortgages, the interest on which ate up most of his rents. The end was already in sight, but my brother was withdrawn from Clongowes and moved up to Blackrock, a little nearer Dublin. Next.
I liked the house in Blackrock. Leoville was its name because of a stone lion over the porch, better than the one in Bray. Stood in Harrisford Avenue next to the garden that surrounded the Protestant church. I had been at an infant school in Bray, and at Blackrock I was sent to a nuns' school, Zion Hill Convent. But as far as I can remember, my brother was left to his own devices at home. Nobody in our house ever cared whether the children studied or not, though Dante and Uncle William were still with us. The latter, however, used to read us fairy stories, working his way steadily to Grimm and to Anderson, and When the story was of the misadventures of some beautiful princess, he would interpolate pathetic asides which escaped us, but were intended for my mother, sewing in another part of the room. My brother was not among his listeners. He had begun to read very much for himself and was eager to study. He used to ask my mother to give him lessons to learn in the books which he had brought back with him from Clongowes and to examine him on them. My mother did so, giving him long lessons which she hoped would keep him busy for a couple of hours so that she could get on with her housework. But in half the expected time, my brother would come back to be examined and ask for more. The habit of examining him on his homework at his own request continued until much later, when we were both at Belvedere, and he was in the junior grade, so between 13 and 14. Anne.
I believe his first essays to write were made here at Leoville, Blackrock. He began to write a novel in collaboration with Protestant boy Reynaud, a year or two older than himself, who lived next door. I have no idea what strange adventures were to form the plot of the book, which was soon abandoned, but I remember the two boys discussing it and my brother writing in the afternoon till tea time at the big leather-covered desk in the corner of the dining room. He tried poetry, too, in the style of the drawing-room ballads to which he was accustomed. My cot, alas, the dear old shady home. But the most successful was a piece on the death of Parnell, which I see mentioned, apparently with my brother's sanction, by the title of A Tu Healy, though I do not remember that it bore that title. It certainly was a diatribe against the supposed traitor, Tim Healy, who had ratted on the bidding of the Catholic bishops and become a virulent enemy of Parnell. And so the piece was an echo of those political rancors that formed the theme of my father's nightly half-drunken rantings to the accompaniment of vigorous table thumping. I think it was in verse because of the rhythm of bits of it that I remember. One line is pentameter. At the end of the piece, the dead chief is likened to an eagle looking down on the groveling mass of Irish politicians from, this is the poem, his quaint perched eyrie on the crags of time, where the rude din of this century can trouble him no more. Next.
The product was much admired by my father and his circle of friends, whose judgment, in question of literature at least, was as immature as the budding author's. My father had it printed and distributed the broadsheets to admirers. I have a distinct recollection of my father's bringing home a roll of 30 or 40 of them. Parnell, however, died when we were still at Braid, so the piece must have been written some months or a year after Parnell's death, because I'm positive that the broadsheet was printed when we were living at Blackrock. My brother was therefore between 9 and 10 years of age when his ambition to be a writer bore its first timid blossoms. The lines I have quoted have stuck in my memory because the dear old shady home and the blandly appropriated quaint perched eyrie were standing jokes between us as late as when we were living at Trieste. Moreover, in the first draft of a portrait of an artist, now called Stephen Hero, the poem was assigned to the period I have indicated. And further, describing a hasty packing up and departure from Blackrock, my brother referred to the remaining broadsheets, of which the young Stephen Dedalus had been so proud, lying on the floor, torn and muddied by the boots of the furniture removers. Next, please.
In Blackrock, the disintegration of our family set in with gathering rapidity. Dante left us and went to live with other friends In the few years that still remained to her before she died, she changed frequently from one friend's or acquaintance's house to another's, and I conclude that she could not find again a family so tolerant of her dictatorship as we were. She had adopted my elder sister, now a nun, then a little girl going on for 9, as a kind of apprentice's lady's maid, and succeeded, as only thoroughly embittered religious people can, in making her life a ceaseless round of tedious duties. While Dante remained with us, we still had the Rosary and the Litany of the Blessed Virgin, at which she presided, seated every evening in the conservatory at the back of the house. The least I can say is that these two words, Rosary and Litany, do not mean for me what they mean for sentimental Protestants who have sojourned into Catholic countries. Yet when she had gone, perhaps in her sour way, she missed the children. Uncle William left us too and went back to Cork. Tom.
I have a few scattered but significant memories of the brief interlude between relative prosperity and real poverty. I remember, for instance, returning with my father to Blackrock in the train from Dublin. In the third-class compartment, the only other passenger was a red-coated English soldier. My father, being in the quarrelsome stage of drunkenness, began to mutter quite audible curses at him. The soldier looked hard at him and edged nearer to us. I was on tenterhooks between them, fearing a row, and tried to distract my father's attention from him by asking childish questions. But the soldier said, "I see you don't remember me, Mr. Joyce." My father, mollified, said, "No, faith, I don't." The soldier then explained that he was the boy who many years before my father used to pay to look after his boat, and told the story of the time when during a storm in the bay, he had begun to cry to be put ashore. My father had dropped him somewhere near Ringsend and sailed the boat back to Dalkey alone. My father, now very friendly, pretended not to remember, but when he got out of Blackrock, I was sent home, and the rebel in the red coat adjourned to a pub to talk about old times. It was still less agreeable when, coming back in the evening from playing with other boys along the foreshore to Blackrock, I caught sight of my father, quite drunk but still elegant and with his eyeglass fixed, playing a piano organ in the main street of the town and crooning "The Boys of Wexford." Meanwhile, the Italian organ grinder stood looking at him with legs crossed and one hand resting on the organ, wondering at what he no doubt called mentally "questi matti dingles." We passed discreetly, the other boys as discreet as I, on the other side of the street, and I hurried on to bring the joyful tidings of his homecoming. Anne?
I wish I could see now, or could have seen then, the funny side of such happenings as my brother did. And yet in a portrait of the artist he writes that any allusion to his father by a boy or a master put Stephen Dedalus calm to rout, and a smile waned on his face. It did not seem so, but of course Stephen Dedalus is an imagery, not a real self-portrait, and freely treated. In the Jesuit schools he attended, masters used to dwell rather heavily on the dangers of human respect, by which they meant doing something or leaving it undone against one's conscience for fear of what people might say or think of you. Their vague words were clearly understood. They desired to put their pupils on guard against a certain inferiority complex that might invade them when, in the little world of Dublin, they came in contact with a dominant Protestant class. In my brother, they found an apter pupil than they expected, or indeed wished for. It is no idle boast to say that at that time there were very few youths, not only among the second-rated middle class of Blackrock, but in Europe, destined to go their way so unperturbed as he, so callous against Upcley, or so determined to set completely at naught any praise or blame that might come to them for the work they considered they had to do. Lois?
I had neither such moral courage nor such love of my father. On the contrary, my antipathy to him seemed to have been born in me. There are some wise people who derive great benefit to their health and peace of mind by sleeping with feet and head in line with the earth's rotation. Conversely, I believe most firmly that when the heart feeds on hatred and contempt, the human being is facing the wrong way. but how is one to blink facts and maintain one's honesty? When my brother read Hardy's story, A Tragedy of Two Ambitions, which is about a drunken millwright and his two serious clerical sons, he animadverted, almost petulantly, on Hardy's incredible woodenness. But I believe, having our own case in mind, attempted a generalization. I said that it was proof of Saxon earnestness and Celtic frivolity that a situation that suggested tragedy to an Englishman produced only low comedy in Ireland. My brother received the quip in silence because he liked neither generalizations nor the implied reference, but he probably chewed upon both. Next.
It is not surprising that the usefulness of a public office served by employees of the kind I have endeavored to describe should sooner or later be questioned by the higher authorities on whom it depended. Furthermore, it was under hybrid control, partly governmental, partly municipal, and hardly destined to a long life. In 1891 or 1892, the office was abolished and the clerks pensioned off. Because of his bad record, it was at first doubtful whether my father would be granted any pension. But on the personal intercession of my mother, the people at the top, whoever they were, assigned him a pension equal to about 1/3 of his salary and amounting to £11 a month. At about the same time, his house property in Cork, or what was left of it, was sold, apparently to make good defalcations. But it was so heavily mortgaged that little or nothing came to him from the sale. We left Blackrock abruptly and moved up to Dublin. Anne.
My father was still in his early 40s, a man who had received a university education and had never known a day's illness. But though he had a large family of young children, he was quite unburdened by any sense of responsibility towards them. His pension, which could have taken in part the place of the property he had lost and been a substantial addition to an earned income, because his and our only means became his and our only means of subsistence. The wish to shuffle off one's mortal load of responsibility is one among a number of common human, quite unrealizable wishes. That, however, does not invalidate it as a literary theme. One of the world's masterpieces, Faust, is based on such a longing. In Ulysses, Simon Daedalus, for whom my father served as model, is a battered wreck in whom even the wish to live carefree has become a vague memory. But if the facets of his character that are presented make the figure an effective and amusing literary creation, that is possible only because the tolerance of literature greatly exceeds that of actual life. Next.
In Dublin, the steps of our rapid downhill progress amid the clamor of dunning creditors on the doorstep and threatening landlords were marked by our numerous changes of address. I have before me a list of 9 addresses in about 11 years, though I cannot be sure of the order. In the beginning, 2 furniture vans and a float were required for the moving. In the end, it was just a float. The burden of these recollections is my father's tipsy boasting. I'll show them a trick. Just you wait. I'm not dead yet. No, by God, not half dead. Who up? What do you think? The weariness of it was partly relieved for his children by that unquestioning acceptance of all things, which is the grace of childhood. And by the capacity of simple happiness, it could be satisfied even with fine weather. But under the strain, his wife aged rapidly. Katrina.
According to my reckoning, we moved up to Dublin in 1893. For the first months of our stay in lodgings, there was no question of our attending school. We had a long vacation, which my brother enjoyed, just exploring Dublin with me at his heels. Then my father took a large, somber old house in Fitzgibbon Street off Mountjoy Square, at that time quite a good residential quarter for well-to-do families. To judge by the size of the rooms, the house had seen better days. Our subsequent changes of address were due to my father's thoroughly Irish repugnance to paying any rent. I do not know what kind of landlord he himself has been in his time, except that during the split, as it was called, when the overwhelming majority of the 83 Irish nationalist members, egged on by clergy, turned against Parnell and left him with only 8 followers, my father quitted his office without leave during an election and traveled down to Cork to persuade his tenants to vote for the chief. It was one of the things held against him when the office was closed down. The 9 addresses, which I recollect over a period of at most 11 years, besides representing a descending step on the ladder of our fortunes, are each of them associated in my memory with some particular phase of our gypsy-like family life. From Fitzgibbon Street, after a few months at a Christian Brothers school, we were sent free of fees at the invitation of the Jesuit Father Comney to the Jesuit school, Belvedere College in Denmark Street, at the other side of Mountjoy Square. Tom.
Microphone, please. Tom.
My vague memory of the Christian Brothers School is that my class was so large that I felt lost in it. And sitting in a back bench, I heard little and understood less. In any case, it did not matter. At Belvedere, the classes were much smaller and surveillance closer. Before I had been there long, I was startled and awestruck to see our Jesuit teacher turn a boy of about 9 across his knees and whack him with a leather pandybat for writing the Our Father at dictation in pencil instead of ink. But after all, priests have so few pastimes. He had other simple pleasures in which sporting spirit was blended with a religious zeal. Then he would come up in a group of boys, rubbing his hands, and announce breezily, "A great day for the Catholics. The ladies of the north side beat the ladies of the south side at hockey. A great day for the Catholics." Otherwise, he was mainly bored. One evening, when I was taking a walk with some other boys towards the Phoenix Park, we met him returning from it. He stopped to talk to us about the lovely evening and our nice little walk, and then suddenly opened his mouth wide in a hearty yawn. Quite unperturbed, he bade us good evening with yawning tears glistening in his eyes and strolled off. There was a humorous allusion to him in the first draft of A Portrait of the Artist. This was the same man who, at my first communion in their private chapel in Belvedere House, began the Mass by blessing himself in English. I suppose God understood all the same, although, of course, as all Catholics know, Latin is the proper diplomatic language to use in conversation with God. Or perhaps he got Adrian IV, that great friend to Ireland, to interpret for him. He corrected his mistake and then got on with his day's work. But I wonder, is anybody waiting outside for the scatterbrained Father Farrelly after Mass with a pandybat? Anne?
Unfortunately, there was this boy in my class who lived at Blackrock and came into school by train. He informed our classmates that my father had run away from Blackrock because he'd gone bankrupt. I considered myself in duty bound to call him a liar, though I knew I was, and to challenge him to fight me after school. The venue given was a quiet spot behind St. George's Church, and we were beginning to have quite a set to when a woman, shocked at such precocious barbarity, began to shout from a window overlooking that side of the square and to call to a man who was passing to stop us. We scattered, but after that encounter, my adversary, whose name I don't even remember, kept to himself whatever other first-hand information he had about her family. Our stay at the Fitzgibbon Street address must have been short, for we were already at our second address when my brother won his first exhibition in the intermediate examinations, a prize of £20 in the preparatory grade. He was 12 at the time and I was 9, and still young enough to wonder how on earth he could prefer to stay at home with a book on a fine afternoon in summer rather than come out to play. I have again a distinct recollection of his refusal. Absolute trifles having an exasperating habit of sticking in the memory while important events escape it. Before we left Fitzgibbon Street, however, my mother had time to get Scarlatina and the youngest brother Georgie to catch it from her. They were isolated after a fashion in a large bedroom on the second floor. The rest of the family, except 2 very young children, remained in the house. Do not remember that any special precautions were taken during the dangerous period of convalescence. The undeclared principle of large but patriarchal families being that there shall be an ample margin to allow for losses while the tougher or luckier ones survive. Okay, Lois.
Our new house was a small semi-detached villa in Drumcondra, in the outskirts of Dublin. I liked it because it was almost in the country at the foot of a low hill, and just near it were fields with a weir into the Tolka, and woods where my school friends and I could trespass at pleasure. Our neighbors in Milbourne Lane, except in the other half of the villa, were farmhands and navvies who lived in dilapidated cottages. Though there were certainly no signs of wealth about the children of our family, the infant proletarians from the cottages were unfriendly and displayed their hostility by name-calling in chorus and stone-throwing. It was quite unprovoked, due solely to that innate animosity observable everywhere in the lower classes to anybody who was not yet quite so lousy as they are. Our house was well down the lane, and we had to run the gauntlet of the unwashed every evening coming home from school. In the end, I had a fight with one of the most active of the catcallers, a little red-headed roughneck who rejoiced in the sobriquet of Pisser Duffy. It was late in the afternoon, and the loungers from the cottages, and even the women, stood around without interfering. In the imaginary portrait for which I served as model, a painful case, my brother has given me the name of Duffy. Next.
After my modest skirmish with P. Duffy, I used to go about with a little group of boys from my class. One evening, when we were about to engage an enemy group of street Arabs, we saw the rector of our college, Father Henry, coming towards us. At the sight of a priest, the street Arabs made off. We saluted him, and he returned our salute, looking at us keenly from under his dark, bushy eyebrows, but did not stop. I fully expected trouble the following day. We had Father Henry for Latin and Greek, and as soon as the lesson began, he called out my name. I stood up. "What were you doing when I saw you last evening?" he asked. I gave a stupid answer. "Nothing, sir." "Do you call it nothing to go fighting ragamuffins on the canal bank?" "I wasn't fighting, sir. In fact, we had only got as far as the preliminary angry parley." "Oh," said the rector, "I suppose you don't call it fighting, unless you have a black eye or a bloody nose." He trailed off into the usual warnings and threats, but I could see that he was not altogether displeased. He was literary minded and imagined me to be a typical schoolboy. That was far from being my description. I was a scraggy, underfed boy with arms like the shins of thrushes, and too conscious of my weakness to be quarrelsome. But there is hardly any way out of it when you have been grazed by a stone. Anne.
Even my brother, in spite of his poise and unruffled temper as a boy, could not escape the aggressive jealousy of his companions. The discussion about Byron and heresy and the tussle with 3 of his classmates in a portrait of the artist is neither invented nor exaggerated. He must have been thrown heavily against the barbed wire, for my mother had to mend the rips in his clothes so that he could go to school the following morning. It was one of the unpleasant memories of Milbourne Lane. A boy was born there who lived long enough to be christened Frederick, and then, after a few weeks, died, leaving in me at least a sense, though not yet the idea of family. The infant had been in the care the idea of futility. The infant had been in the care of a certain Dr. Tui, the father, so my mother told me, of the artist Tui, who long afterwards painted an excellent portrait of my father as an old man. It was at Milburn Lane, too, that my father made a vague attempt to strangle my mother. In a drunken fit, he ran at her and seized her by the throat, roaring, "Now, by God, is the time to finish it." The children who were in the room ran screaming in between them, but my brother, with more presence of mind, sprang promptly on his back and overbalanced him so that they tumbled onto the floor. My mother snatched up the two younger children and escaped with my elder sister to our neighbor's house. I remember that a police sergeant called a few days after this pretty scene and had a long talk in the parlor with my father and mother. We were at last on the same level as the navvies and farm laborers around us. Nothing else came of it except that there was no further actual violence, though we lived amid continual threats of it. Next, Duncan.
My brother was less affected by these scenes than I was, though they certainly influenced his attitude towards marriage and family life. Half-hushed stories reached us of somewhat similar happenings in the families of friends of ours, whose material position, at least, was assured and normally comfortable. Poverty cannot, therefore, have been the root of the evil. The main struggle of the various Mrs. This bodies and Mrs. That bodies with whom we were acquainted was to conceal carefully what went on at home. But not more than a couple years later, it became my brother's set purpose to reveal it. The first short stories he wrote at school, Silhouettes, were neither adventurous nor romantic. They were already in the style of Dubliners. But that attachment to his father, which was to be one of the dominant motives in his character, remained unchanged. When he went up to Clongowes, the home he left was moderately prosperous and happy. He came back to it when a holiday atmosphere prevailed at Christmas time, and so well as I remember, at Easter, and during the long summer vacation. Summer was always a boon, and the wild freshness of morning clings about early memories. As he remained at college until he was almost 10, he knew only the most gracious aspects of our family life, the more amiable side of my father's character, and the image of him formed in those years was never to be effaced. Moreover, he could escape from it all into the domain of fiction. A little later, he noted a memory of his reading of the novels by Erckmann Chartrian, La Invasion, at school, L'Ami Fritz, the Juif Polonaise, and others for himself, in which these collaborators do not seem to have produced the effect they desired. Next, please.
No school tomorrow. It is Saturday night in winter. I sit by the fire. Soon they will be returning with provisions, meat and vegetables, tea and bread and butter, and white pudding that makes a noise on the pan. I sit reading a story of Alsace, turning over the yellow pages, watching the men and women in their strange dresses. It pleases me to read of their ways. Through them, I seem to touch the life of a land beyond them, to enter into communion with the German people. Dearest illusion, friend of my youth, in him I have imagined myself. Our lives are still sacred in their intimate sympathies. I am with him at night when he reads the books of the philosophers or some tale of ancient times. I am with him when he wanders alone or with one whom he has never seen, the young girl who puts around him arms that have no malice in them, offering her simple, abundant love. hearing and answering his soul, he knows not how. Next, please.
Those days, my brother used to study so eagerly that when we went picnicking on Howth or to the Bull, he would bring with him little notebooks with summaries of history or literature or lists of French or Latin words so that my mother could examine him after lunch. It did not spoil the outing, though I sometimes protested. Before lunch, we had a swim, and in the afternoon, a stroll around Howth Head or along the North Strand. And in the interval, the examination occupied half an hour or so of a warm and lazy summer noon. The weekly English composition was a strong point. AMDG ad majorem Dei gloriam was piously inscribed at the top of 2 leaves taken out of the centre of a copybook. And then there followed 4 pages of bright ideas on such inspiring subjects as love of country, independence, or make hay while the sun shines. He was never at a loss what to say, but wrote quickly without making a rough copy beforehand. Then came the conclusion, LDS, not an anagram of LSD, but a Jesuit motto, Laus Deo Semper, praise to God always. His English teacher, George Dempsey, Mr. Tate in the Portrait of the Artist, soon noticed his turn for composition. He pointed him out to the prefect of studies as a boy with a plethora of ideas in his head. And when my brother passed into higher classes, Dempsey used to read his compositions to the class to serve as models. In the end, he took it for granted that Gussie, as he jocularly called him from his second name, Augustine, would be a writer. My brother seems not to have been unmindful of his encouragement, for I've heard that from Paris he remained in correspondence with the old man until his death. The rector showed less appreciation. What caught his attention was the signature at the end, J.'s A. Joyce, with a whirligig of flourish underneath, on which he commented ironically, he would have appreciated modesty and submission. Well, he just didn't get them.
My brother was never, I know, my brother was never subject to the moodiness or plain tantrums that so often impelled me to go up to my room when my father came home, followed by his artistic parting shot. What a loving son. And the footnote says, my God, you're a loving pair of sons, you and your brother. It's from Stephen Hero, page 207. Okay. Much more than his reputation for being clever, his good humour and gaiety made him a favourite with his many sisters and relatives. And neither brawling in the house, nor tireless political rantings to cronies, nor the near implicity of tipsiness ever spoiled his accord with his father. The full £20 that he won for his exhibition in the preparatory grade was handed over by his father to the young boy to do what he liked with it. My brother had no idea what to do with the money, for £20, in purchasing value equivalent to at least twice that sum today, was too much pocket money for any boy to handle. He bought presents for all of us, practical presents, a pair of boots for one, a dress for another, and there were frequent visits in which I was occasionally included to the cheaper parts of theatres to see Edward Terry in his comedy parts, or Iving or Tree if tickets could be had, or the lesser lights, Edmund Tierley as Othello, or Olga Nethersoul. Clever as he was, my brother was still little more than a child and liked to play with the money. He opened a bank for the family in order to play at issuing receipts and making up accounts. I know. I had unrequested loans of an odd sixpence or so pressed upon me. That was like the banking crisis. But his parents were the principal and most assiduous customers. Oh dear. And the money soon melted away in dribs and drabs. Yet even so, at the beginning of those years of squalor, he could still be happy in the satisfaction of effort crowned with success.
My brother accompanied my father on a few rare trips out of Dublin and seemed to enjoy traveling with him. At least he went willingly. When the property in Cork was sold, he had gone with my father on what I think was his last visit to his native town. In a portrait of the artist, the visit takes place later and awakens in Stephen a raw sense of unrest and spiritual discomfort. But my brother's letters home at the time were written in a tone of amusement, even when he described going from one bar to another. While we were living in Milbourne Lane, there was a further visit of a few days in summer to Glasgow at the invitation of the captain of one of the Duke liners, who was a friend of my father's. The great joke of the visit, which was spoiled by rain, was that my father, soused to the gills on the return trip, had a heated and noisy argument about politics with the captain, an anti-Parnellite. Fortunately, the captain was a teetotaler on board, though not one on shore. By God, man, my father would conclude in telling this wonderfully good story, if he had been drinking, he would have thrown me overboard. Next.
I can picture my brother as a handsome young boy, all eyes and nerves, traipsing about in the muggy drizzle of Glasgow after his tipsy father. In Dublin, I have more than once seen children younger than my brother was at that time trying to lead a staggering mother home. Why, I wonder, seeing that people pretend to hold by the Decalogue, has it never been thought fit to add a postil enjoining some kind of consideration for children to the fourth commandment? Can Moses have forgotten it in the hurry of jotting down more important matters, such as the commandment not to covet one's neighbor's house, nor his wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass? I do not know how long an indulgent landlord allowed us to occupy the house in Milbourne Lane, but it was long enough for me to find out for myself the fascination of books. It was there I first read a whole book alone, though it took me about 6 months to do so. The book was David Copperfield. Much of the novel was beyond my comprehension, but its sentimentality and oddity were within my reach. More than half of it was vivid. It awoke and satisfied some longing in my imagination. In the attempt to cast the parts among the people I knew, the one about which it seemed to me there could be no discussion was that of Steerforth for my brother. But my brother never cared for Dickens. Before we moved out, the big, bony father of Master P. Duffy called to say goodbye. He was received in the dismantled parlour, and over a bottle of stout expressed his regret for past misunderstandings and offered the good wishes of the cottagers, so that we left in a halo of peace re-established. Anne?
I have a clearer recollection of our next house, as I was already about 10 years of age when we moved into it. It was the house in North Richmond Street, described in Araby. It stood in a quiet neighborhood, North Richmond Street being blind, and as my brother says, an uninhabited house of 2 stories, really of 2 stories and a large basement story. I stood at the blind end, detached from its neighbors in a square ground, a garden with apple trees. The rest of the story of Araby is purely imaginary. In the preface to the American edition of Dubliners, Padraig Colum says that this story and the sisters are evidently recollections from childhood. This is a mistake. In fact, only 2 of the stories, An Encounter and A Mother, describing a concert at which my brother sang with John McCormack, are based upon his actual personal experience. The remaining stories are either pure fiction or elaborated at second hand from the experience of others, mostly from mine, as I shall show later. In An Encounter, my brother describes a day's mitching, which he and I planned and carried out while we were living in North Richmond Street, and our encounter with an elderly pederast. For us, he was just a Jiggins. Neither of us could have any notion at the time what kind of Jiggins he was, but something funny in his speech and behavior put us on our guard at once. We thought he might be an escaped madman. As he looked about 50 and had military air, I nicknamed him the Captain of 50 from a phrase I had seen somewhere in a biblical quotation. My brother did not write the story until after he had come to Trieste. I was still in Dublin, and when he sent me the manuscript, as he always used to do when he completed a story, I suggested my nickname for the fellow as the title for the story, but my brother preferred his own title for it. And Duncan?
Okay, I think we have read well and plenty, and I think we should actually stop here and have a little bit of a discussion.
This is really great stuff. I think it's
Yeah.
wonderful.
He is so funny.
Yeah. He is funny and he's very easy to read.
He's
and
very
very
funny,
clever.
but in this very subtle, dry.
Yeah, it's great.
But it's fantastic to get his description of an encounter, having recently read it here.
Yes. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
And the background on Dante.
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I don't feel half as upset by Stephen in Ulysses now, having sort of got a fuller picture of Stephen's father. It's it's really scary stuff. Trying to choke your wife.
Only one time, Joe.
Yeah, it's beginning to get serious,
But enough to bring the police.
Yeah.
I know when we're reading this, we're probably putting it down to he was a drunk, but I think he had mental problems just on what we're reading here. This isn't just a guy who gets violent when he's drunk. I think there's a real problem somewhere.
Yes, but there are so many. There are so many, just like Mr. Joyce.
Yes.
I mean, that part, I really appreciated that part that talked about how, I guess Stephen realized that, this was not unique to his family, and it was not unique to people in poverty, though of course people in poverty have less opportunity to kind of cover things up and smooth things over. But there's a lot of this, and I'm not, it's astounding. One of my jobs one time was, this was when I was very young. I had just gotten to university, and I had a job as the night attendant at a small mental hospital in Austin, Texas. And basically, my job was to do a few things for the patients in the early evening, and then I was to be there to assist the nurses if necessary. So I actually would sleep there all night. And the place where they put me to sleep was in the doctor's office where all the files were.
Oh, boy.
And so to entertain myself and to pass the time, I would read files for hours about all these different families all over Austin, Texas. And it was a mind opener.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, you're right, Lois, in the sense that, there's something definitely wrong.
Yeah. There's
Yeah,
one
I agree with you, Lois, because he broke it off with all those girlfriends because he was very jealous of them, which is very weird.
Yeah, I'd say the girls might have instigated the end of things, but there's one word jumped out on page 50, on my page 50. There's a paragraph ends there. We left to Black Rock abruptly, and it says, About this time, the house property in Cork, or what was left of it, was sold, apparently to make good defalcations.
Yeah, I wrote that one down too. New to me.
That's an internal theft. That means, and I vaguely remember reading as Sinelman, that there was, to use what the phrase we used in the accounting world, some confusion about taxes collected that didn't seem to have reached the cashier.
Yeah,
Ah,
yeah.
And,
That's what defalcations means to me.
oh yeah, it's an internal theft.
Yeah.
That's the defalcation is not a loss on trading or anything like that. It's the cash, cash being misappropriated, and it's interesting they closed down the whole department, and there might have been difficulty getting a pension. So, clearly he was told, people claimed to have paid their taxes, and yet they were not.
Oh, no record.
The books, and they all back, and he says, you're missing X over your career. You have to make good it, and you have to sell the house. So it's first time they used that word, and Stanislaus is a man who knows what that word means. It's not just a word to be changed later in the drafting. So it's kind of interesting, and add to what Anne says about the. Or was it Lois? I think. Sorry, forgive me if I got it wrong. About it seemed to be more issues there than simply poverty and.
Oh God, yeah. That's probably that wouldn't help the situation.
There's nothing.
Definitely.
There's nothing in his background that would warn you that was coming.
Right.
There's a lot of stuff in there.
Yeah.
That truly amazes me. Like I'm fascinated by the parallels between the lives of James Joyce, William Shakespeare, and Dante.
Right.
There's a lot of parallels there. They're all born into a time of serious cultural turmoil and change. They all have fathers which have some dubiousness in their background and get into trouble with the law. Not so much Dante, it's a little more vague, but there's some references to his father being in the money lending business. And of course, we know that I know just recently, thanks to Joe, those films are great. That Shakespeare's father got into huge amount of trouble by dealing in illegal wool.
Logging, wasn't it? Logging.
Yeah, but anyway, I mean, I'm just bringing up the fact that this all seems to have something to do with serious creatives. Is there certain things that happen in their lives that allow them to see beyond the normal way of seeing somehow?
Yeah.
So I got a question. So was part of John Joyce's job to go and collect taxes from people?
Yes, he was he was a rate collector. The rates are the taxes' name. So he was a tax collector. Those are notices he's supposed to send out to Mr. Kenny, your taxes are due on the 5th of April or whatever. And a lot of people paid things in cash.
Yeah.
And the door of their house, when eventually, having fallen into arrears, the knock comes to the door, and So he said, well, I can give you half now. And if you go away for a while, and, and he says, okay, I'll come back in 2 months for the other half. And for a man like John Joyce, who I would say was urgently in need of a drink from time to time.
Yes, the temptation would have been great, shall we say.
Yes.
And all that sort of thing, So, yeah, but that was, he had access to cash. And then, the three things you look for, if you're just looking over the records of employees, extravagant lifestyle, access to cash, and the third one is loyalty, which prevents them from taking holidays. That's the
Yes.
Oh,
Oh, it's a red flag. A red flag.
Not to be
What
discovered.
is it?
Yes.
I missed that, Joe. What was the third one?
Access. The third one is an excessive loyalty to the employment, which prevents them from taking the days they're entitled to. In other words, a guy, if you go in and people would say, "Oh, who's in charge of cash at that branch?" "Oh, that's Murphy. Murphy's a great guy. He works so hard. He's never taken a holiday in the last 10 years."
Yeah, obviously.
And they always, this place can't do without me. Places that you and I know in Dublin have that ring about them, Thomas.
Yeah.
Cannot be done without,
I just think that, the discussion about money and all that kind of, it's kind of, it's extraordinary that Joyce paid no attention to it whatsoever. That he treated money like, he never had any money when he was young. And then when he had it, he just lavished it and threw it everywhere. And he earned very little money himself. He kind of got money. So I don't think that kind of thing mattered so much. And the curious thing is that, as it says there, that he was attached to his father, regardless of all this kind of moral or social kind of judgment in retrospect on his father, that Joyce didn't see it that way whatsoever. And he continued to, I suppose what he did was, in his writing, he actually laced his great book, Ulysses, and in fact, Finnegan's Wake, with everything his father kind of said or did, or everything. And Stanislaus is fine in kind of delineating the kind of the matter-of-fact things as they went on, but Joyce transformed it into something else. Stanislaus didn't write Ulysses, he didn't write Finnegan's Wake, or he didn't take all the songs of his father and put them into his books, or he didn't kind of, so I think it's a kind of wayward way to be. It's well written in a very flat sense, but I think we're way off the mark if we're talking about James Joyce as a writer and his father as a character that gave him so much, or that Joyce chose that this was the person that he was going to use most extravagantly in everything that he had written. So whether he took money, he didn't take money, whether he was antisocial or whether he was a terrible character at home, literally great writers are littered with this kind of background all over the place. So I think for me, the fascination is that Joyce actually took his father, and despite all this that we can dwell on in a kind of social or moral sense, Joyce decided to take his father and put him throughout everything that he had written. So I think that's extraordinary.
Yeah, it's really one for, you need to study psychology to understand.
Yeah.
I'm thinking my own relationship with my late father, like it's a dark continent. There's no explanation
Yes.
feelings, that you have for your father, and as you say, no sense of judgmental,
No.
and it's remarkable. Whereas this is a bit moany, isn't it? A little bit, he's kind of, he's like he's an outsider. Maybe it's between eldest
Yeah,
sons.
yeah, Stanislaus is that way. Yeah, no, there's no doubt about that. Stanislaus is much more. He's a moralist,
Well, yeah,
and he's a disappointed moralist, I should add.
yeah, yeah.
That Stanislaus at least gives me the impression that although he will stand up for morals and all that, he really doesn't expect anybody to change.
Yeah, yeah.
He's kind of one of the last of the moral people. But he's very funny in his resignation.
Hmm. But it makes you think, what are the factors that creates an artist? You're saying a Shakespeare, a Dante, or a Joyce. I don't know what the answers are, or even begin how you'd find them, but it's a mystery.
Kind of a slipshod answer that I have is that they are able to see through the cracks that other people can't see.
Mm.
Well, for example, to take his father, James Joyce looking at his father, he used his father as a crack in reality
Yeah,
that he assumed was not just his father,
yeah, yeah,
and that can allow one to see deeper and further.
yeah.
And as much as we like to cover things up and make things pretty, I think as human beings, we have a fundamental need at some level to see things as clearly and as openly as possible.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of like also, his whole thing, James Joyce's thing about having a lot of money. Sometimes he had a lot of money. And yet he seemed to work diligently along with Nora to get rid of it as fast as possible.
Yeah.
And my really probably illegitimate way of looking at it is that this was his way of being able to keep in contact with the top of society and with the bottom of society.
Yeah, yeah.
That he wanted to enjoy the luxuries. He wanted to buy the luxuries, but at the same time he wanted to commiserate with those who had to leave in the middle of the night to escape from debtors and to find a new place to live.
Yeah. And you see, he, in a sense, experienced life at every level of society. And for a man who was like a sponge, picking up memories, ideas, it was all material to write about.
Yeah.
Whereas from a well-run family where you just in X years you inherit Y money, you've got nothing to write about.
I think Tolstoy, there's that famous Tolstoy comment about happy families. Happy families are all the same.
The same.
And unhappy families, there's an endless variety. And there was a little hint in there that it's happy families are a little boring.
Yeah.
There's no novel in there.
Yes, there's no novel in there. That's a good way of.
What I liked in the thing was that little bit where Joyce set up his little bank, within the house.
Yeah.
And he
Oh,
spent,
funny.
but that his parents were the people that were mostly involved with it, you know.
Yeah, yes, major customer and subsequent.
Yeah.
P. Duffy, the father of P. Duffy, coming round to declare peace.
Well, and Joyce using the name Duffy for the experience with the guy in the field, and Joyce named his brother character Duffy.
Mm.
So I did like the part where, you know, when John Joyce went to grab his wife by the throat and everybody else is going crazy. And Stanislaus says, but my brother, with more presence of mind, sprang promptly on his back, overbalancing him so that they tumbled on the floor.
So all that rugby he didn't like in Clongowes suddenly came to him.
We discussed encounters before, and I thought the discussion was something like, we don't know what the guy was like that came upon the young boys, but Stanislaus seems to know what he was about.
Yeah,
I thought that was interesting.
What I find very interesting.
I thought that was very interesting as well.
I had forgotten that because I have a reading of Encounter coming up, and now I know.
Yeah.
You know, I don't have to on the one hand, on the other.
Well, the guy goes off to the side, and the young kid says, in a shock, "Look what he's, what's he up to?" And
we're dealing with a pederast, and that's it.
So Stanislaus is putting it out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I can't believe the number of properties they had as residences.
Yeah.
In 10 pages.
There's a whole book on that very subject.
Yeah. I have a book that has listings of all the addresses they had in Dublin with pictures.
Yeah.
And of course, Joyce himself followed the same pattern. He moved from flat, apartment, country. He just kept on the move. It didn't seem to matter to him whatsoever. But sometimes he'd know he wasn't even paying for the places, or he just got in, or he just, but it didn't bother him at all moving anywhere. And I suppose that came from his itinerant childhood and adolescence.
That's why I say a psychologist, he may even have needed to live like that. So, sorry, Tom, I cut across you there.
No, I
was going to say, to have a job though takes discipline and scheduling, and if you're a creative artist, it's a lifestyle that cannot follow a clock. It follows the creation of the work.
Yeah. I think there's a description. I don't know where it is, but when they were moving from Blackrock into town, or maybe another move, they were walking along the road, and the father was singing kind of songs, and joining in behind.
It sounds familiar.
It's like kind of it was kind of, this is it, like, it was kind of
I think if I had been raised like that, moving every year, every month, every 2 months, when I became an adult, I would have found a place and stayed still. I never would have moved again. Whereas James Joyce has done just the opposite.
But as well as that, I mean, it wasn't as if it was only 2 or 3 people that were moving. The whole family, like, you know what I mean? It wasn't like, even if it was 2 or 3 or 4 even, but it was the whole family and their possessions and in the go. And
the language and everything, Tom.
Yeah.
Because they moved country as well. it was fine for him because
Yeah,
he was
and I
perfect.
mean, John Joyce, like I think he was staying out in Fairview, and he found some clause in the rent that some illegal kind of thing, and he stayed on for about 2 years without paying any rent. I think the landlord was named Love, and I think Joyce puts him into maybe Ulysses. I think, yeah.
Yeah, the Reverend
But
Love, Father Kelly's landlord.
sorry. Go ahead, Joe. Yeah.
No, I just say I was just throwing Father Kelly's landlord was the Reverend Love, and he sent the bailiffs around to Father Conway's. There are two bailiffs. The Reverend
Yeah,
Love.
we did. Yeah, we just read that thing in Wandering Rocks.
That's right.
Yeah.
You know, and obviously how to manipulate the rental laws was a topic.
Mm. Mm.
And who would be in line to collect debts? You know, I mean, it's still true here in the United States. You know, one of the first things is, you know, who gets paid with what's left, who gets paid and who doesn't get paid anything. Big topic. And I know in the United States, the eviction process, you know, it's very strict. You have to do things in a certain order. And if the landlord does not perform these things at the right time and do it in the right order, and it goes before a judge, the judge will just throw it out.
Yeah.
And say, I'm sorry, you didn't do this properly. You got to start all over again.
It takes about 3 months to evict somebody in San Francisco, anyway.
In Ohio? Oh,
No, in
okay.
California.
Yeah,
Between notifying them and
from place to place. Yeah.
Yeah, and then they argue and anyway.
Yeah,
In New
well,
York,
I mean,
if you haven't gotten
they are the people on the other end of the stick, so to speak. The people who are doing the renting, or you know, they can have families, they can, you know, suddenly have lost their job, and yeah, and there are, you know, like tenants units. There's a tenants aid thing here in Austin, Texas, where a tenant can go and talk and get legal advice on what to do. And, you know, it can cause the process to go on.
Oh, the process can be dragged out on and on and on. And
Yeah.
it's a lot of landlords in Dublin resort. I shouldn't make a statement, but there is resort to informal methods of
Yes.
resolving the situation rather than going to the court, because you know, the courts just drag on forever. And
A big thing in San Francisco was that landlords would buy out your lease. If if the court system failed to accommodate your removal, you were encouraged with I know that some of the grants went up to $60,000, but you couldn't make a lateral move and still live in San Francisco, because at that point the rents were so expensive that
Right.
it never matched what you already had under fixed rent under the tenants rules.
Rent stability.
Yeah.
Rent stability. Yeah, it's tough on everybody. And the actual fact is, it's really tough on everybody. There are some unscrupulous landlords that have tons of money that, you know, but a lot of landlords are just barely above their tenants.
Yeah.
You know, maybe they have 1 or 2 units, they own a lot of money on it. They were hoping to, you know, make a little cash on it. And then, you know, they get a tenant and the tenant loses a job and the tenant can't pay. So it's hard on the tenant. It's hard on the landlord. It's a big mess.
Yeah. Well, you hear, you've got the phenomenon in Ireland of the mom and pop landlord, you know, the people who are married and moving on in life, and they decide to buy a second house. And so they're really amateur landlords. And then they run into all sorts of problems, like tenants who sell everything, sell all the furniture.
Yeah.
I know one case where there were 2 marble fireplaces in a house. You know,
Oh no.
they when they got the and my one of my relations who's a carpenter, this is going back to the 1970s, had to go into a house where the floorboards had been sold.
Oh my God.
Firewood. Yeah, like banisters, stairs taken out, and tens of thousands back then to rebuild the house.
Oh.
Yes. For a while here in the United States, it was copper wire.
Yeah. Anything of
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Downspouts.
Yeah.
Copper downspouts.
And the water tank, was for scrap metal and just leaving the water running through the house.
Yeah.
All that sort of thing. And if a corporation can deal with that, but a mom and dad landlord,
Yeah.
and you can't even get into the house to see what's happening. So you do. So it's not a business for an amateur.
Yeah, very few are these days.
Yeah, very few.
To switch to slightly more pleasant topics, I was very surprised at Stanislaus talking about how much James Joyce loves sports.
Yes.
Yeah.
And swimming.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, with a flair for speed and endurance as a runner.
Yes, this did not fit my image.
Yeah. Of course, he's a skinny kind of a bloke. He's got the build of a man.
Yeah, he would be a runner or a swimmer. Those are both built for swimmers. But the fact that he presents himself, well, what we assume is his alter ego and his literary works as not being athletic, and not even liking water to the extent that he doesn't like to bathe.
Doesn't bathe.
The real artist. Yeah. It's also, I suppose we have to bear in mind, this is a first draft. It's never got into a published.
Never got edited.
Or a report read on it or that. And in that context, it's very, very well written.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that he you can sense he one of the things that Stanislaus definitely had, that he recognized Joyce very early on. Now, I know he was his brother, but he did recognize that he was some kind of genius very, very early. And that he looked up to him in a certain sense all the time. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I suppose this book as well, there was no L-Man, It comes out later in the 50s, whereas, this would have been an absolute treasure trove of information for a reader. Whereas we have all read L-Man or heard bits of stories. And so I can see how exciting it would have been had it been published in 1952 or somewhere,
Well, it's lots of fun. It definitely is lots of fun and very interesting. And I'll be curious to see, the quality of the pages we read today, in my humble opinion, is that they are much better than the earlier pages that we read.
Yeah.
There seems to be a definite improvement.
Yeah.
Yeah, he has a sense of humor kind of running underneath a lot of the stuff. And at the same time, there's a kind of touch of resentment about certain things.
Yes. Yeah.
He definitely kind of detested his father.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
God, yeah.
Oh, and yeah,
And the church.
and the church. Yeah,
In church, yeah.
yeah.
Great descriptions of the church, isn't there? You know, the commandments need a slight amendment, you know, to include
Yeah. Yeah. Moses missed out in a bit.
Moses.
He was in such a hurry to take them down.
Yeah. But I imagine that it's probably harder to write the very first pages because you've no memories of that
Yeah.
early, and we'll gradually get more and more. I don't know, can't remember how far up the book goes.
It goes to when Joyce is in his early 20s.
Right,
Yeah.
so it will be.
Yeah, and then Stanislaus dies shortly after the book is written to that point.
Yeah, he didn't get to finish it.
No, he didn't.
We will in an
Mhm.
area where he'll have more memories and more adult memories of adult events.
Yeah,
So,
would have been nice to
yeah,
have the whole thing.
yeah.
It would have been great.
Yep.
Well, I gotta go.
Okay, well,
Okay,
thank you
bye.
for joining us. And, I'll make one more comment and then ask for other comments and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay.
But the comment that when Joyce goes to Clongowes, the description that Stanislaus gives, and there was no reason why let's see, he seemed perfectly free of his surroundings, a boy among boys. There was no reason why he should not be. He was always in the top of his class and always in good health.
Mhm.
So once again, we have our character and the portrait of an artist, who's getting pushed around by the bigger boys and
Mhm.
gets pushed in the ditch and his glasses get broken, and then
Broken.
he gets a bad cold
Yeah.
or minor pneumonia, whatever it
Oh.
was.
Yeah, and writing to mother, come and get me. You know. Yeah.
Help, help. Yeah. So, anybody else have a last comment, question?
I think he was. I think he was the youngest in his class as well.
Who's the youngest? Okay.
Yeah, I think so. In the class.
Yeah, I know that was
6.5.
I was the youngest in mine.
Yeah.
Me too.
One of the men at the house in Bray, you know, who'd be my own age, said that having read Portrait and having seen the surroundings of the house in Bray, he regretted that he hadn't been more understanding of his own son when he sent him to boarding school, because he's basically he's in a female world where he's cared for, he's surrounded by affection and love. And he's to be a boy among boys. That's quite a jump for a child. And he was just making that point that sitting here in the house and visualizing what it was like has made me regret that I should have listened more to my son way back. You see, like the son's now an adult, you know. So it's interesting that it's kind of the point that you're raising, Duncan, as well, isn't it? That this a boy among boys is a phrase Stanislaus is using. Like, that's a man's man, a boy's boy, you know, not a mammy's boy.
Yeah. So I want to remind everybody that when we meet next Monday, we're going to have a special treat that will not be recorded.
Oh, that's me.
A field trip.
God, I'm getting nervous.
So if possible, come back on Monday and encourage others to do the same. So, okay.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, I am too. And it'll be
Thank
fun.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everybody.
Bye.
And
Bye-bye.